Hello everybody, this is Jonathan Thompson. I run the PASS team and I'm hoping that you can all hear me now. We're going to talk about PASS, the Pupil Attitudes to Self and School Assessment, and I'll take you through it now. Just a little bit of background to set the scene for you. PASS was developed about 10 years ago by 3 educational psychologists. And for the last couple of years it has been a part of the GL Assessment division of GL Education. PASS took about 6 years to develop, which involved 4 universities and about 20 local authorities here in England. So that was a considerable amount of development, something that probably wouldn't normally be able to be done in a corporate environment. But because it was done by educational psychologists in authority work, it was fine. They involved a lot of children during that development. So what I think is really interesting is that a lot of the impact and decisions that were made during the development of PASS were heavily influenced by what the children that they were working with fed back to them. The way that PASS became a commercial product was through the guys who originated it going to seminars, scientific and research-based seminars and conferences, and at the end of it people coming up and saying, we'd like to use that. So they realized that there was something that they could do with that. And what is interesting is in that all the time that we have been using PASS, providing PASS to schools, the large part of our growth comes from one school recommending it to another. About 80% of our new business comes through recommendation. And of course, being part of GL, we provide excellent customer care both during and after your survey. Now, why are attitudes so important? Psychologists will tell you that attitudes are difficult things to measure. They're a soft area. But our belief is that if you can put numbers, if you can measure attitudes and put numbers on them, then for a start you can see what's going on, but also as you put in intervention you can influence attitudes. Why would we want to do this? Well, at the top of your triangle there you've got attainment. Everybody wants the children to attain to the best of their ability, whether it's a Department of Education for a country, a local authority or a district, or the school and everybody else. So if we can influence the attitudes that have an impact on attainment, then clearly that's good. Similarly with attendance, and it may not necessarily be physical attendance, it may be mental attendance. If we can persuade children that school is a good place to be and somewhere where they can improve their life chances, then clearly that will also have an impact on attainment. So in very simple terms, that's really what we're looking at. Let's look at the process to begin with of how PASS works. It's a very simple assessment, and the first stage is what goes on within your school and your pupils. And I've put some points here. And by the way, at the end of this presentation, this webinar, you will be given a link which will take you to this presentation. So you can take it and use it yourselves. You can read through it afterwards, so you don't necessarily need to take great notes right now. So before you begin the assessment, it's very important that both staff involved and pupils and possibly parents as well understand what's going on. And one of the first things is to stress to students that this is not a test, it's not something they can pass or fail, it's an opportunity for them to feed their thoughts back to school on how school, in their particular case, could be improved or is already perhaps meeting their demands. I'm looking here at the online version of PASS, which covers from age 7 to 8 up to about 16 or 17, that age group. We do have PASS for younger children than that and also older children, but for the purposes of this webinar, I'm going to look at that age group. So you can get your pupils to do the survey using your school's ICT facilities, so they could come in groups depending on how big your room is, all sit down, run it together. It takes about, as it says there, about 15 to 20 minutes for the students to complete the assessment, but obviously if you're going to set the scene beforehand, you're probably going to take 30 to 40 minutes for each group to go through. For the statisticians among you, PASS is a 4 AFC 50-item rating scale. For the rest of everybody that is not a statistician, what that means is the children are going to read 50 statements and going to make a choice about their attitude to those statements. And the 4 AFC means that they have 4 alternative forced choices. They can either choose yes a lot, yes a little, no not much, or no not at all on each of those 50 statements. You'll notice there's no middle ground. They have to take a position one side or the other of the fence, and also there is no opportunity for them to enter text. Perhaps later on in this webinar you'll understand why that is. PASS is standardized for any time in the year, so you don't have to do it at a specific time, although there may be times in your calendar when you don't want to do it, such as just before exams. Also, it's good when you're running it year on year to try and choose a time that you can repeat year on year so the children are in roughly the same frame of mind. As I say, it takes about 15 to 20 minutes for children to complete that assessment. The reading age, chronological reading age of the assessment is age 7, so most children we feel will be able to read that themselves. We do have a number of foreign language translations in order to help children for whom English is not their first language, or children who need specific help, children with additional needs or maybe visual impairment. They can have the statements read to them by an adult. All we would ask is that that adult or helper does not try and lead the student into their response. You must allow the children to make their own choices. While the children are completing their assessment, you can log into a secure area and track those audits as they go through. It's obviously a password protected area for you. You can check and amend the student's personal data, i.e. their date of birth, their name, year group and so on. Obviously you cannot change their choices on the statements. And then at the end you click notify, which will send that data to us and request a report. That report will be downloadable from the GL website. You'll get a link emailed to you which enables you to go to that report. And within that report there is a PDF giving you a whole school report and some Excel files which give you the individual pupil data. And later on in this webinar we're going to go and look at those in a lot more detail. So that's the process. Let's now I just want to tell you before we go that there is some new stuff coming down the line. PASS is moving to GL Assessments, GL Education's assessment platform known as TestWise. There are some big advantages in that, and that will be coming later on this year. Some of them are here. The pupil data will be imported directly from your school's management information system, so therefore the children don't have to do it themselves, which reduces the possibility of incorrect data going in there. The survey screens are going to look a lot nicer, and we are introducing audio at all levels for those children that may need it. The language variations will be on screen so the children can read it themselves and may not need somebody with them, and the surveys go through automatically. Probably the biggest advantage of being part of TestWise, being on the TestWise platform, for those of you that use other GL education assessments, we can then customize reports and integrate data for you, not only with GL's own assessments, but possibly with other data coming from your management information system. So all the PASS products will shortly be available on TestWise. Okay, now the heart of PASS is the 9 factors that we measure. So those 50 statements that the children have commented on, or made a statement, made their own chosen position on, feed into these 9 factors. It's quite a complex routine that goes on in the background, but we come to these 9 factors, and it's very important that we all understand what these 9 factors mean. These were the attitudinal measures that were chosen by children who said, if you really want to know about us, these are the areas that matter. So a form of pupil voice, if you like, both feeding into the assessment and to the outcomes as well. So I'm going to go through them quickly with you so that you can understand a bit more of what they are. As I say, you will get a copy of this presentation, so you don't necessarily need to write them down right now. Feelings about school is all about how a child feels within the school and the environment around them, the physical infrastructure, if you like, around them. Do they feel safe there? Are they happy to be there? Are they comfortable there? Is this a good place to be? It's their self-concept there, if you like. If you get a low score here, that would suggest that a child feels alienated, perhaps, maybe being bullied, certainly does not feel comfortable there. How might you use this measure? Well, if you were putting into school something like an anti-bullying campaign, then it would be useful to measure factor 1 first, feelings about school, run your campaign, and then remeasure at the end in order to get an accurate idea of the impact of your campaign that's been done there. It's also about the bricks and mortar. So if you're changing your school around, perhaps a building project, or maybe the classrooms being refurbished or changed around, this will also give you a measure of how your children feel about those changes to the physical infrastructure around them. There is a partner factor to this, but I'll come on to that in a moment. And I should say that all these factors attitudinal factors, are statistically independent, but as we'll see later on, there can be some quite interesting dynamic links between them. Perceived learning capability is a measure that looks at how a pupil feels about their recent experience in the classroom. Has it been good? Do they feel positive and successful? Or has it been perhaps not so good, making them feel a bit less confident about the whole process of learning? It's very interesting to measure this one, particularly as pupils come into your school, so you can find if they're bringing any baggage with them, perhaps as they move from one year group to another, to see whether that's suiting them, whether they're as happy as they were before, and so on. So these are recent learning experiences. But as those experiences build up, we move down to self-regard as a learner. This is a more long-term measure. You'll notice this is not self-esteem. Self-esteem is important. We all need self-esteem. But self-esteem is much wider. How do I feel about myself as a person? What we want to measure here is a narrower measure of self-regard as a learner. Self-esteem can be quite a challenge. Quite often, the most challenging children in your classroom are very high on self-esteem because they believe that they are right and it's you that's wrong, which is why we narrow it down to self-regard. Factor 4, preparedness for learning, is all about metacognition, knowing, have I been taught how to learn? Have I been provided with the skills to do the things I'm being asked to do in the classroom? Do I feel confident that I have the tools provided to me and I've learnt that process? What's interesting about this particular factor is that it also turns out to be a great indicator for reasons for behavioural problems in the classroom. And I suppose you could take from that if a child comes into the classroom and doesn't feel they've been skilled up to deal with what they're being asked to do in the classroom, they then feel that they've got another 20, 30, 40 minutes to fill somehow, and maybe they're going to mess about or kick off because they're bored, possibly, because they haven't been given those skills. The interesting thing here is that if you identify those children, and you'll see that later on in this presentation, how to do that, you can put in something like targeted study support, a bit of coaching for those children to improve their learning skills, and quite often, very often in fact, that solves the problem of behavior at the same time without you having to do anything specifically about behavior. Attitudes to teachers, again, this is about the staff and the teachers around them. It's not necessarily about a specific teacher. If you remember, there is no opportunity for a child to enter text or to name names or say anything. It's just a general attitude to the staff. Usually this is one of the highest scoring factors, and some teachers find it a surprise to find that pupils actually do like them. If you like, this is a well-being factor. If a child has a low score here, it would suggest perhaps that they feel that the staff around them are aloof, not listening to them. Obviously, high scores here would suggest that the children feel comfortable and are happy to be with the staff that are around them. Factor 6, general work ethic, is one of the factors that actually is bigger than just what's going on in school. This is about a pupil's motivation to work in life, really. And quite often you'll find that children who have a pretty good plan as to where they're going in their life may well have a high work ethic. Perhaps they have a family business that they think they're going to go into. Perhaps they have, if they're at a day school, they may have a weekend job, and they will score high on general work ethic. They may, of course, be the ones who don't feel, because of that, they don't feel particularly connected to the curriculum. If they've got a high general work ethic, it may be that they don't understand the reason to concentrate on history or foreign languages or things like that. But it's an interesting factor to watch. Another life skill is confidence in learning. This is about perseverance and stickability. When a child is faced with a challenge, do they rise to that challenge, regardless of whether they've been prepared for it or not, or do they bring in a self-imposed barrier to learning, saying, I can't do that, I've never seen before, I don't want to have a go. So it's, again, a life skill. Challenges don't stop when we leave school, sadly, so we have to learn how to cope with those and persevere. Attitudes to attendance. This is exactly what it says. It's not about whether a child is in school. You've got that on your register. This is really whether a child feels that they want to come to school and stay there. Now, many of you may be boarding schools, so your children may not have the opportunity to vote with their feet, so to speak. But it is still relevant, because if there is a mental approach to their attitude, if in their heads they don't want to be there, they're not happy there, then this is clearly going to influence their learning and bring in a barrier to their learning process. So it's important to measure this. We'll come back to that later on in the presentation. Finally, the last one here is another motivational factor. This is the response to the curriculum, and really measures whether a child understands that working hard in school will help me in my life. We'll look at the dynamics of the data later on, but it's usually quite interesting to compare factors 9 and 6. In other words, the general work ethic, if I work hard in life, will that help me? Compared to factor 9, well, if I work hard in school, will that help me? And there is quite often an interesting comparison between those two. So those are the 9 factors. That's the heart of PASS, and we can take a lot of direction from that and learn a lot about what's going on with your pupils from those 9 factors. So I hope that all makes sense to you. What you get at the end, if you were using the individual standalone version of PASS as opposed to the online version, is a bar chart like this. If you're on the online version, you have that in an Excel format, which we'll look at later. But looking at this bar chart, what we've got on the left-hand vertical side is a percentile score, which is on a line between 0 and 100, and along the horizontal axis, we've got the 9 factors. So it's important that you understand what percentile scores are. They're basically using our standardization database, which at the moment is just over 600,000 records, in order to position an individual piece of data against that standardization. So if, for example, you take that factor 9 score and I think it's about 2%, that means on that particular factor, this individual pupil is scoring above only 1% of their peers nationally and below 98%. So that would be a low score. If you take factor 5, for example, up there, that might be 60%. That means they're scoring above 59% of their peers nationally and below 40%. I hope that's clear, because it's quite important later on when we look at the report itself. Let me tell you about this case briefly, because I think that will help to explain how you can use this bar chart. This profile here is actually of a case study of a young boy in Year 8 who had been described as highly disaffected and was about to be excluded from school. However, an educational psychologist was asked to look at him and talk to him. He happened to have PASS with him, so he used PASS to try and assess this child, this young boy, and this is the profile that came out. As he was explaining the various factors to the young boy, communication wasn't great to begin with, but it got better as it went along until we got up to factor 6, where it became clear that this young lad, who had been described as highly disaffected, lots of low-level disruption in the classroom, actually had a very high general work ethic and did want to learn. He wanted to get on in class despite the low factor 9 score. he felt he'd got a learning disability which had not been recognized in the school, and as it turned out in the subsequent conversation, it turned out there were problems going on in his home between his mum and dad, and this was affecting how he felt. What he wanted to do was talk to somebody. Hence, he was unable to talk to the teacher who was trying to run the lesson. He would just chat to anybody that wanted to listen to him. From looking at this profile, and I'm going through this very quickly, what the school was able to do are these interventions that are here. They put in some reading support to improve that factor 9 score in order to improve his readability, and they put in some targeted study support to affect factor 4. Remember, that was the one that can give you an indication of behavioural problems, and also whether he felt he was skilled up to cope with what was in the lessons. They put in some mentoring for him, both with peer mentoring to help build up his confidence, his factor 3 score, his self-regard, and some adult mentoring with staff members that he was confident to talk to. And this was to enable him to unburden himself, if you like, and get a view on that. The peer mentoring helped to build up his confidence, the targeted study support gave him the skills, and the reading support helped him with his study. All of this meant that the child was not excluded and actually went on to fulfill his academic career right through to the end and go on into college. So what I'm trying to show here is that actually by looking at those 9 factors, there's an awful lot of possibilities that we can draw from that. We often get asked about before and after. There is a minimum time between assessments that we recommend of 10 to 12 weeks. What I'm showing here is 2 profiles of a young boy. A younger boy. This was a boy who was about 9 years old, who had been excluded from school. He went to a special school for children like that. The first profile there, the very flat one, is a pretty terrifying profile, but the staff put in some intervention, drew breath, did what they do best, and 12 weeks later got the second profile. Now, I think it's very interesting. It's still not a perfect profile, but clearly I would say that child now feels listened to by the staff, feels that he has become somebody who's paying attention to him, and he feels starting to feel a lot more comfortable. So over a relatively short period, a significant impact has been made, and I can tell you that this young lad was successfully reintegrated back to his primary school as a result of the interventions from the special school. So that's how PASS works. Let me just sum up this part of the presentation with another triangle for you. We like triangles over here. Psychological textbooks often talk about the A, B, C of attitudes. Affective, behavioural, and cognitive as the 3 main areas. And the reason that we're keen on this is because this is really what's going on in school. If you have an attitude to something, it affects how you feel about it, how you behave towards it, and how you think about it. So if we can influence those attitudes, we are in fact impacting on the affective, behavioural, and cognitive areas of the classroom and of individual learners, and we can hopefully try and identify barriers and do something about those barriers to try and remove them. Okay, I'm going to break now for a bit while we have some questions. And I have some questions here. I've got 3 questions that have come in, so let me just talk about these briefly with you. Okay, somebody's asked about fragile learners. I'm going to come on to that later on in the second half of this presentation. So I'll give you a brief moment now. Fragile learners are the learners in your classroom who are not a problem for you. They're not behaviourally difficult. They have good attainment, but at some point in their career, they will not deliver the results that you've been anticipating. And we'll look at that later on as to how we can address that, how we can identify them, and how we can do something about it. Learning barriers is another area that's been brought in and asked about here. Now, learning barriers are something that different children have different barriers that they will bring in with them. They may bring it with them from a previous school or a previous experience, And what PASS will do is help you to understand what is going on in a child's head. What are the things that matter to them and that are influencing their learning styles. You may have, for example, two children who have very similar profiles, if not necessarily exactly the same, very, very similar. You will then probably decide on very similar intervention strategies for those children and put them into place. Later on, perhaps 12 weeks later, when you reassess those children, I would suggest there's a very strong likelihood that the profiles of those two children will no longer be the same. In other words, the same intervention strategies will have different impacts on the two children. And why not? That would make sense. But what PASS will enable you to do from that point is then to say, okay, for child A, we need to change the strategy, tweak it a little, and for child B, we tweak it differently. In other words, you are then personalizing their learning and your intervention strategies to the specific learning needs of those two different children. So that's how PASS will help you to identify that. I've got another question here, which is about whether the testing has to be done as a whole cohort. Actually, you may have heard me mention there that there's a standalone version of PASS which enables you to assess an individual child, which is separate, although connected, to the online assessment, which is for whole groups, or preferably the whole school. So you can do both. We recommend that you as a school assess all of your children with the online survey. You may choose to do that once a year. We have a certain number of schools who do it twice a year, but once a year is probably closer to the norm. Having tested all of your children, you can then look at those results and identify the individuals that have the most needs and that you want to focus on, and you may want to assess those children more frequently, and that's where the standalone version comes in, so that after 10 or 12 weeks you can reassess an individual child and then see what impact has been made by any intervention that you put into place between there. So you have the option of doing both. The online will enable you to take the whole school through the assessment and give you whole school and whole cohort results. The standalone version, which you can repeat as many times as you like with different children, will tell you how the improvements are being made in between. Somebody has asked me the cost of the survey. That is related to the size of your school in broad terms, but it is based on a whole school survey for the online version. So for a primary school, the costs run from about £450 per survey on a 3-year contract, and for a secondary school, about £850. And I guess some of you may be right through primary and secondary, and we will have to create some pricing for you. Now, within that price, you get both the online survey, which will enable you to do the whole school, and you also get the standalone version, which enables you to do some intermediate assessment between whole school surveys. I think at that point, that's about all the questions we have right now. So let me take you on. How are we doing for time? Okay, so we've looked at how the survey works. Now let's focus a bit more on the report that's coming back to you. The look and feel that you've got here is actually based on the existing survey and report. That will change slightly over the next few weeks and months to a new look under TestWise, but the content is exactly the same. On the screen at the moment, you've got a bar chart and, if you like, a line from a spreadsheet, two different things. So let me tell you first that if this is your first survey, what I think is very important is to look at that top bar chart. This is showing percentage scores, and those percentage scores show how you as a school, in isolation from the rest of the world, are doing. In other words, this is you regardless as to what's happening with other schools around the place, around the country. And this is very important that you look at this first, because this shows what your students are saying about your school and your staff. The next thing I would say is to look at the highest scores there and celebrate what your students are saying to you that you do very well. In this case, we've got some high scores there in the 70s. You may find that you're actually getting up into the 80s and even the 90s. And celebrate what your children are happy about. Having done that, you may want to look at some of the lower scores and say, well, decide which areas is it worth your while, or do you want to focus on to find out how you're getting on. You'll notice that I haven't looked at the bottom percentile scores yet at all. I'm still working on the percentage scores. Further down the report, I haven't got time to show you this in detail now, you will find breakdown by year group and by gender and by ethnicity. So when you're following a particular factor or a couple of factors, you can drill down from the whole school into your year groups, into your genders, gender splits, combinations of those two, in order to identify where within the school are the areas that have the most need at the moment. Let me come back to the percentile scores, because these link your scores, your individual school scores and individual pupil scores, with a national standardization. So what these are showing you is how you sit as a school compared to other schools within that standardization. It's very likely that the senior leadership team and the governors, perhaps, the directors, will be interested in those standardization scores. But I think for most of the staff within a school, it's the absolute scores that are key. Particularly when you get to your second and subsequent surveys, using those percentage scores in the bar chart will show you how you have changed as a school in the intervening period between surveys. And that's just you as a school and your score. Obviously, the percentile scores are interesting there as well, showing how you may have changed relative to other schools, but bear in mind other schools will also perhaps be changing as well. So if you like, the senior leadership team will be interested in the percentile scores to see how you as a school sit with comparison with others. Staff, heads of year, heads of subject may be interested in the absolute scores and the percentage scores. So, having looked at the whole school and drilling down through the cohorts, you then get to individual and cohort reporting. This is a little chunk of one here. We'll look at bigger samples in just a moment. And they are coded by color. These are percentile scores showing the individual pupil and their name, so you can identify them, their year group, and then their percentile score across those 9 factors. And we've color-coded them to make it easier for you to get a quick visual take on what's there. I think if there was no colors there, it'd be very hard to kind of get your head around the numbers. The way we've banded them at the moment is that the green ones are in the lowest risk. They have the least needs, and they're 21 to 100 percentile. Amber are the medium, and 6 to 20 percentile, and red is your highest, people with the greatest need in the lowest 0 to 5 percentile. You'll see in a moment that we provide this data to you in Excel format. So if you are familiar with Excel, this is conditional formatting, and you can change those colors and the bands as many times as you like. In fact, when we move into test-wise, I believe we're going to 4 colors and 4 bands simply by changing that formatting. So let's look at something a little bit more realistic here. This is a real, some anonymized data from a school, the sort of thing that you're likely to get. As you can see, you've got there should be tutor groups down there, so you can sort pupil names, the year group, and their scores. And immediately you're starting to see a pattern there of reds, greens, and ambers. Now, it's quite interesting. I think our human emotional response generally is to look at the reds and ambers first and go, ooh, yes, well, I expected that of him. But I think also it's worth looking at the greens to see the high scoring greens and see how that fits with your view of the students in your school. We don't know your students at our end, so I can't make any comment about particular individuals here, but you can because you know your students. So look at the scores and then try and get a pattern there, see which children have the most needs, and you can do this by sorting. As I say, the reason we put this into Excel is so that you can do various things with Excel. And I would say at this point that if you're not an expert on Excel and you can't find one, but you would like to do some of the things we're just about to look at, there are some very good help videos on our website that will show you how to sort data and how to filter and do other things. So let's look at sorting data. The reason we have those colors, as I said earlier on, is to help you get a visual impact on which children are in need of your intervention. So sorting will help you identify them in groups much more quickly, and then you can use that for allocating resources, allocating staff, and working out how you're going to do what with whom. So I'm going to do a simple sort here across these scores, and I've taken a subset here on self-regard, which happens to be column F. So I'm doing that in this case here with Office 2010. Done that by identifying, highlighting the kids, and choosing, I think it's the data menu at the top there. I'm going to sort them from smallest to largest, and here we go. So now, very quickly, I have highlighted and identified by grouping them from in this way. I can see the children who, probably those top three would need some individual attention. Maybe the ambers you could deal with as a group, and the greens may not be less of a concern. I wouldn't say that the greens are no concern. You may well want to group some of those in, I think, student 16, 15, whichever it is, 16, scoring 21.2, you may well want to include that as an amber. Or you can put in other bands if you want. Interesting how the pattern has changed not only in self-regard, but with some of the other scores as well. And you may want to think about that when you're choosing your intervention strategies. I mentioned attitudes to attendance. I've done a simple sort here on attitudes to attendance, and I've got 4 students up the top there in red, 1 in amber, and then some quite low scoring greens before we get higher up there. Again, as I've said, that if you've got children who are able to truant, if it's a day school, then this can be of concern, and let me explain why. Why would I want to do that? We did some research a year or 2 ago, taking a sample of 1,500 children, and we measured their attitude to attendance scores. A year later, we came back and measured their actual attendance and compared that with the previous year. What was really interesting was the incredibly high correlation between low scores on attitudes and a year later actual truancy. It was 0.9. That means 9 out of 10 kids with low factor 8 scores were beginning to truant the year later. So it took about 12 months for the impact of what was going on in their heads to reach their feet. In a boarding school, they may not have the opportunity to do that. However, nevertheless, if they feel they don't want to be there, this is going to have undoubtedly an impact on their learning skill. If you're in a day school, you may well want to be watching those scores. And if you've got children coming into your school from elsewhere, this is an interesting factor to look at to find out how they feel. It may be a measure of how they feel about their previous school, or the change that has happened in their life, or where they are in your school. It's also an interesting factor to look at as you remeasure over the years and children move from one year group to another. Now, fragile learners, we mentioned those briefly in the Q&A just now. We feel, well, this is a name that I suppose we've come up with. Some people call them the grey children. I don't like that personally as a description. But fragile learners are children who, in your classroom, are possibly in the middle of the classroom. They're behaviorally fine. They're not a problem to you as a teacher. Their attainment's looking good. They don't have behavioral difficulties, and they're the ones that you don't need to worry about as you're teaching. You're more concerned about the kids at the back and down the sides, who you're trying to keep control of and keep on track. However, about 1 in 5 students are what we would describe as fragile learners. And generally speaking, the identification of them comes a bit too late. They've gone through a test or an exam, and then that text at the top there, I would have thought they would have done better than that, is what you hear. And the problem is that by the time you're thinking, I thought they would have done better than that, it's too late. They've gone past that test, that barrier, if you like, in their life. And the difficulty is because they're in that invisible group in the middle of the class, they're below your radar, you haven't spotted them, but actually it comes down to the fact that they may have got in with the wrong group of children. They may have had something happen in their lives, and they've been knocked off course. The way that you can identify them is by matching a pass score with some attainment or CAT data for you, plotting that into a scattergram, and again there's a help video on our website, and then plotting them on a chart like this. Those kids in the amber square there are your fragile learners. They're attaining well, but their self-regard is low, and they need the psychological help. The flip of those, of course, are the people in the top left who need coaching or targeted study support to help them. Another way of looking at your past data would be to match the curriculum demands in F9 with CAT data. Here you're trying to get the kids, again on a scattergram, into that central zone within their comfort. You can work out for yourselves why I've put boredom and anxiousness there. There are some combinations that you may look at. I mentioned earlier on that the factors are statistically independent of each other, but some of the time you can look at these suggestions I've put in here and then look at the data and see whether any of those things are giving you some inferences that you want to look at and work from. Okay, finally, I want to look at the online intervention system. Now, this is, at the moment, a separate program which will shortly be joined together with PASS within TestWise, and it's a resource that you can dip into when you need to. What you do is take the data from your PASS report and put it into the online intervention system, so you're taking those percentile scores on the factors and the individual student data, and this will then generate for you a list of possible interventions that you can consider. Two things I want to stress here. One is that this does not replicate or replace your own expertise and knowledge of the children. This is simply a resource. And also, it is not saying, here's your problem, here's your answer. It's going to list for you, as you can see here, some strategies, some of which are nationally selected and some of which are randomly picked. And they're just a resource to help you. There are about 3,000 different strategies in our online intervention system, and you can dip into those, as you can see. Whoops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. You can dip into those, and you may well say, actually, we're doing a lot of these, but hopefully we'll give you some prompts in there of things that you might try. Okay, we've gone through at a rattling speed, and I've come now to the second lot of questions. Oh, got some interesting ones here. What does a perfect profile look like? I don't really know, actually, because I don't think there is quite such a thing. You may, as I said earlier on, you may get profiles that are high in a lot of areas. That may well be, if you've got greens all the way across the line, that's pretty good. But I don't think there's such a thing as a perfect profile, just in the same way as you possibly don't have a perfect student, although you may have described some of them as that at different points in their life. I've got another question here, which is about CAT and TestWise. Now, perhaps you would have seen, if I go back, whoops, where am I going? Going back. There we go, wrong direction. Apologies for that. If I go back to fragile learners, here is a way that you can use CAT data and PASS data together, because you can use that ability score from CAT and plot that against the PASS data score, either in factor 2 or factor 3, perceived learning capability or self-regard. Plot those together, and I think you will find that extremely useful in terms of identifying fragile learners. You could also use that when you're assessing children that come into your school. Use the PASS data with your CAT data in order to identify which set or year group you're putting children into. I think the two of them work together in order to help you get a more full picture of the individual kids coming in, and where you want to put them within the school and how you want to work with them. I think we're coming to the end now of our time. So here I've given you some useful contacts for you. That's me at the top there, Jonathan Thompson. My colleague Andy Kendall is our customer services manager for PASS. So if you have any technical questions or customer service questions or anything to do with PASS really, you can ask us. And of course James Neal is our international director, and he will be working with you in terms of the commercial aspects of how you can use PASS within your school. I really hope this has been useful for you, and we will be very happy to take any questions by email that you think of subsequent to this webinar. So please do keep in touch with us, keep working with us, and I hope you start to use PASS and get good results from your data. Thanks very much.